Warning. Today's stories are very dark, ranging from death, suicide, harassment, and murder. You have been warned.
This happened just after the COVID pandemic. At the time, I lived in a large house right on the outskirts of LaPorte, Indiana. Me and my 3 older brothers lived there. I had a job as a traveling quality auditor for BMW, and my job was to travel around the country to different BMW dealerships and do surprise audits, then report back to the higher-ups, basically for things like unauthorized markups, etc. I've seen a lot of sketchy things done at these dealers, including defective parts being installed on cars just so people would be forced to come back to the dealer again. I wasn't very well liked by a lot of people because they knew when I reported back to the higher-ups they would get in a lot of trouble for these things. Anyways, it was a cold day in December, and I was scheduled to go audit a dealership on the outskirts of Chicago that day. The dealership was closing in a few months anyway due to skyrocketing crime in the area, so I had no idea why they even wanted me to audit it, but whatever, it's the job. I got up at about 4 a.m. to make the long drive there, and I arrived eventually and began to audit them. The owner of the dealership was there that day, and he definitely wasn't happy to see me. He was a tall, skinny man with black hair and skin that seemed way too gray to be human. The whole time he just kept staring daggers at me, and even following me around while I went over everything. The whole time I was getting weird vibes from this guy. After auditing everything, I knew this place was going to fail the audit big time. But it's important to note that I'm not the one who makes that decision. I just report everything to the higher-ups. I finished my audit and left and then went home, then just went on with my life. About a week later, I had gotten word that due to a whole lot of shady stuff going on at the dealership, it was getting shut down ahead of its scheduled closing date. I didn't think too much about it because, well, I didn't really care, and I just went on with my life. A few weeks later, I had finally had a day off work, and I was just getting back home from the grocery store, and when I came close to my house, I had noticed a black BMW with tinted windows parked in the road in front of my property near the driveway. This was unusual because we lived in a rural area and there's no street parking. I also wasn't expecting any visitors, and anyone that does come to visit me usually pulls in the long driveway all the way to the house. I slowed down and looked to see if anyone was in it, but the windows were tinted so you couldn't tell. I pulled in my driveway and unloaded everything, then went inside. I figured maybe the car had broken down or something, which wouldn't surprise me considering how poorly built BMWs are. A few hours later, I had looked out my front window to see if the car was still there, but it was gone. I then went on my day and forgot about it. A few weeks later, it was about 7 p.m., and I was really exhausted after getting home from a 13-hour shift. When nearing my driveway, I had noticed the same black BMW was back again, parked in the same spot. I was too exhausted to really care though. I just pulled in the driveway and then went into the garage and went inside. 2 of my brothers were home that night, and I had brought them dinner, so we had sat down in the living room and ate. After that, I took a shower and got in bed quickly since I had to get up at 3 a.m. the next morning. I woke up around 1 a.m. and I noticed it was very cold in the room. I was a bit annoyed and I got up to check the thermostat in my bedroom. It read 58 degrees. The boiler was on, but the room was cold. I thought that maybe the boiler had broken since the house was very old. Then I felt a cold breeze and I noticed my curtains were moving, so I walked over and checked and noticed that the window was open. Since it was winter, that explains why it was so cold in the room. I knew I had locked it, but I thought maybe one of my brothers had left it open since they have a bad habit of leaving the windows open around the house. I went to close it, and I noticed the wood around the lock was damaged, and so was the lock. That's when I had a bad feeling come over me. I turned on the bedroom light, and I saw feet beneath one of the other floor-to-ceiling curtains, and then saw the shape of someone behind them. My heart started to race, and the owner of the BMW dealership had stepped out from behind the curtain holding a revolver, and he had a crazed look on his face. He pulled the trigger after pointing the gun at me, but by some miracle, he had forgot to switch the safety off, which it gave me just enough time to run out of the room and then run down the hall. I locked myself in the bathroom and grabbed the wall phone and then called 911. One of my brothers must have heard some commotion because he came out of his room and then yelled my name. As I was on the phone with 911, I had heard a pop followed by a thud and then my brother screaming in pain. Then the guy started shooting the bathroom door and kicking it to try and get in. But thankfully, the old doors in this house were really thick and solid, so he couldn't get in, and by some miracle, the bullets didn't get through it. The shooting stopped, and I'm assuming that he ran out of bullets. I had heard footsteps run down the stairs and then the front door open and slam shut. I ran out into the hallway to see my older brother on the ground bleeding badly, and I told the operator that he had been shot. The police and the ambulance then arrived in about 15 minutes. Unfortunately, my brother died on the way to the hospital. The guy was caught just before crossing back into Illinois by a highway patrol unit since there was an alert out for his car. He was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, murder, as well as attempted murder and some other small charges. He was given 50 years in prison. I had quit my job for unrelated reasons a month later, and a month following that, I had sold that house and moved out of state. I just can't believe that guy was so upset over losing his dealership that he actually felt the need to shoot the messenger. For context, I'm currently a 26-year-old female. This story, though, started when I was 16 and lasted until I was 19 or 20. When I turned 16, I was very eager to get a job and start making money. I really wanted a car to buy myself, as at the time I was living with my mom, and I didn't really have a good relationship with my dad, and my mom was a single mom of 3. I got my first job with a major fast food chain. I started a week right after I turned 16. My coworkers and my boss were really cool. They let me smoke cigarettes and hang out there just to get away from my home life. There was this one guy, his name is Corey. Not a fake name, by the way. He was about 25 at the time that I was 16. He wasn't very attractive, but he was super cool to hang out with because he would bum me cigarettes and he would let me vent about my high school drama almost on a daily basis. We became friends. Fast forward a couple of months and we were on shift talking, and I told him about my laptop that I got for my birthday and how it took a shit on me. Corey was a super tech smart guy, and he had offered to fix it up for me. It didn't bother me at the time, but it does now. I got my laptop back from him, and it did indeed work. I used it all the time before I got it fixed, so it was really nice to have it back. When I got home that night, I noticed that the camera light was on. I didn't think much of it, and I told my mom, and she pushed it off as maybe it just stayed on all the time. At the time, I was dating someone. We'll call him V for the sake of the story. V was active duty in the Army, and he lived 9 hours by car from me in a different state. We Skyped every night that we could, me being 16 and him being 18 at the time. We did some pretty crazy stuff on Skype that I won't go into detail about. That will be important later in my story. Soon after, I had started getting some weird Facebook messages. The messages were from alias accounts, saying things like, "I really love what you wore to school today. I'll be watching you at work. I can't wait to see you." Things like that. At the time, I replied back telling whoever it was that I was going to report them to the cops. Unfortunately, they didn't have much to go on due to the messages coming from an alias. The messages got creepier by the time I graduated high school. I reported it to the police multiple times. They always said they'd take a report, but nothing ever came of it.
I miss you. I love you, not your TV.
That's a message I got one night when I was home in my second floor apartment watching TV.
Who do you have over tonight? She's really pretty too. What's her name?
Those would be the messages whenever I had friends stay the night with me. My mom would have me walk to the grocery store sometimes to get things for her, and I would get messages like,
You know, you shouldn't be walking this late at night dressed like that. There's some real creeps out there.
like if they were watching me, constantly. I just got to the point where I ignored the messages. After I graduated high school, I had put my notice in at the fast food chain that I worked for, and then moved where my boyfriend at the time was stationed at. I was now 18 and the year was 2015. We got married shortly after, and the messages continued, even though I lived 9 hours away from where I used to live. I lived with my then husband where he was stationed until late 2017. We moved back to where I used to live and went back to work at the same fast food chain that I used to work at in high school. At the time, I had a 3-month-old baby, and my husband and I were working towards our own place, so I had to take the first job I could. My boss was the same, and lo and behold, Corey still worked there too. We caught up on life and worked together a lot, knowing I was still getting creeper stalker messages. A couple of months later, I took a better job with better pay at a major car dealer in the area. That's when the messages got mean.
Ugh, I really hate that you left. I can't watch you work every day. I really hate you for leaving me. You'll pay for this.
About a year later, my husband and I separated and I got my own apartment with my daughter. It was late 2018 at the time, and I started getting messages again.
I'm so glad I found you again. I'm so glad you're single now because now you can be all mine.
My daughter would spend every other week with me, so on my off weeks after I turned 21, I would have friends over all the time. One night, my stalker messaged me that they knew that I had a male friend over. We'll refer to him as Jay. We were strictly friends and we hung out all the time. While Jay was over, I got a knock on my door. When I opened my door though, no one was there. For context, I lived on the 3rd floor in an apartment building that was completely enclosed with stairways on both ends of the building that were also enclosed. No key or fob was needed to get into the building. I looked both ways out of my door, and I then noticed I had gifts on my doorstep. No note, just flowers and a meal from my favorite restaurant. Now, Jay was still at my place when this happened, so I finally had a witness because at the time my stalker was also messaging me on Snapchat under the name Cody Johnson. They finally gave a hint that I used to work with them. I asked if it was Corey, but then the Snapchat account that was messaging me was then deleted. I now had a very high suspicion that it was Corey, but I had no proof. The last gift I got was about a month later. I threw it away when I left for work that morning. When I got home though, the gift was back at my front door. I just left it there for weeks until maintenance picked it up and did whatever with it. After that, the gifts and messages stopped, and I haven't heard from them since. Fast forward about 6 months ago. The girl that I used to work with along with Corey, who we'll call S, had reached out to me on Facebook. She told me that Corey had been messaging her from Facebook on a phone from prison. Now, this caught me extremely off guard. She sent me the link that explained why he was in prison. He was there on charges of cyberstalking as well as possession of child pornography. He targeted a 17-year-old girl and lured and filmed 2 14-year-olds in his apartment with a security camera. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. That was a shock to me because he had fixed my laptop for me, and the camera light was always on after that. He stalked me for 5 years. It just makes me wonder if he had anything of me or what his real intentions were with me. With that being said, you can't always trust those that you make friends with. Stay safe. Hi, my name is Kara. I've been an EMT for under a year, but I'm currently sitting at 8 months of being an EMT. But the story happened when I had only been working for maybe a month. Trigger warning. This story does contain a suicide along with the firearm mention. I was on my truck on our way back to the base that I was stationed at from our main base. The tones go off for a GSW to the head. The address they gave us has 2 different streets with the same name, but one was lane while the other was street. The truck whose area it was in was out on another call, and we were so close to the actual address, but we were told it was the other address we were supposed to go to. We staged at the wrong area, waiting for the law enforcement officers to secure the scene, before we're then told the real address and we had to drive there instead. We got there, and we were told it was to the thigh by one of the law enforcement officers, so we didn't take in all we needed to. While I couldn't get inside because the trailer was small, I heard all about the scene. The guy was laying on his couch, and his son was with him trying to stop the bleeding. And my partner and the other crew on scene, along with our assistant chief, all figured out it was in fact to the head. They had to move him quickly because he began seizing, and brain matter splattered everywhere, even on my partner. It was my first trauma while truly working and not on orientation, and my adrenaline was running sky high. I knew that all 4 of the others had much more experience, so I had stepped back and just gave what they needed. Nasal airway and portable suction unit. I did what I was told, but I can never forget the sight. It's burned into my memory. There was a hole in the right temple of his head and a lump right in the same area, which we believed to be the bullet. As soon as they were able to, the second EMT got up front to drive their truck while I drove the other unit's truck behind them. He was airlifted out, but the flight crew told us that he was circling the drain as soon as they were about to land, and he ended up not making it. The cleanup I had done before, but it was still difficult to have to clean up someone's blood. Once the truck was cleaned, I was doing all I could to hide my emotions, but one of my coworkers told me to walk with him back out into the pay, and I did. He asked how I was, and I just bursted out in tears. I didn't even understand my emotions at the time. My mind was a mess, and so he took me to the AC room with our AC with us. We talked through it, and I told them my thoughts, how I didn't think I deserved to cry because I wasn't as involved in the care as my other coworkers were, who all seemed fine. But I was reassured that it was okay and normal, and the warning I was given was later on in the day, once the adrenaline fully left my system, depression would hit. And it did. But I was luckily able to talk with my coworker about it. Later on, I found out that the guy had been really struggling with suicidal thoughts and depression for a while, so his family took his handgun away from him. But he had gone to counseling and had been taking his medications as he was supposed to, and a week before the incident, he had asked for his gun back, and they gave it to him. That day, they lived beside them, and they heard a pop, but thought nothing of it. They tried to get a hold of him, and after an hour after the pop, they finally went to check on him and found him. I feel so horrible for the family, knowing that they're likely still harboring the guilt for it. This story comes from my dad. When he was in his 20s, he was headed to work and he came up on a train track. Something to know before I get into it. The train lights were down, and there was a bend that you couldn't see around. Therefore, if a train was coming, you wouldn't be able to see it until it was way too late. There was a man hired to sit in a spot to be able to see around the bend and stop people from crossing. Now on with the story. My dad had pulled up to the main track as a man began to cross it, and at that moment, a train came around and then hit the man. The car spun off the tracks, but amazingly, it didn't roll. My dad hopped out of his car and ran to the man and saw tons of blood and that the man's skull was not hanging on well. Without hesitation, my dad ripped his shirt off and then put pressure on the man's head. As he did this, the man who was supposed to be watching came out and peered into the car and then began to freak out. He was running in circles, panicking, and saying the man was going to die. The man who was still conscious asked if that was true. My father responded saying that it doesn't look good, but that he's going to be fine and to just keep talking. At this point, he had also yelled at the worker and told him to get on his radio and get an ambulance here immediately. The man did as told and then ran back into his shelter. Meanwhile, the train finally came to a stop, and the man again asked how bad it was. My dad let go a bit, and he could see that the man's brain was exposed. He quickly put pressure back, and the man told him to give it to him straight. My dad explained the whole truth, and the man proceeded to ask if his hair still looked good. After what felt like forever but was realistically only about 5 or 10 minutes, the ambulance and police arrived. The paramedics took over for my dad, and as they were transporting the man, the shock seemed to have worn off and he went limp. As the cops were talking to get the story from my father, the boss showed up and cussed the worker out and then fired him. It turns out he was sleeping instead of paying attention. A few days later, the man had actually called my dad and thanked him for saving his life. If it hadn't been for my dad holding him in place, he would have bled out. The county even offered to help my dad go to school to be a paramedic, but he declined as that's really not something he wanted to see every day. The scariest part is if my dad had been there a minute sooner, it would have been him that got hit instead.